Anyway, here we go. There's been a lot of talk um, about obviously AI for the last 2 years, but more and more of a crescendo. And I wanted to talk with Elizabeth, really. We've had a lot of great conversations about this subject, about like what we're really seeing in the world. Lingoport, of course, has built a lot of AI facilitating capabilities into our continuous localization software, as well as our internationalization tools. But I wanted to speak about what people are seeing in the market very much. So it's a very lively subject. I bet if I was to have a professional um, poll that about 98% of you attending and people listening to the recording have been asked by someone in your organization, hey, just use AI. So this is a conversation that is oriented towards that. All right, I'm going to first introduce our guest, Elizabeth. Um, Elizabeth, she's Dr. Milkovits. Um, but I haven't called her that. But I should pay proper respect for you, Elizabeth. All right. So Elizabeth has had a really interesting career at a few places like Amazon. I have worked with Amazon individually with many engineers and the like. They have used our software in the past, and they hire really smart people. So I'll lay that compliment on you. I've always been impressed with everyone I work with in the Amazon organization. But um, she's driven a lot of AI translation. You can read what's on the screen here. It's quite a good history. She's doing independent consulting work with Nimdzi these days, and probably most of you know who Nimdzi is. They're sort of one of the foremost localization consulting groups around. All right, so we're going to go through a bunch of questions for Elizabeth. Again, we'll address audience questions at the end of these series of questions. So, all right, let's start with this. What are some successful uses of LLMs in localization today?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me today, Adam. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. And this question is a great one, and it's really timely because a lot of people have been asked to implement AI, and why can't we just translate? And aren't LLMs supposedly really good at this? And the
Mhm.
truth is they've gotten substantially better. Like
Mhm.
recently, like the multilingual benchmarks and all of this it is very different than it was 3 years ago with this technology. So many things have gotten a lot better, and people have been figuring out good use cases for it. A lot of the things that people have been able to do reliably have been more on the AI facilitating side. They've been things more around how you manage data, how you do quality checks, and how you can analyze patterns. And many of those things weren't possible at scale before. And those cause problems in translation pipelines. So people have gotten a lot of value already out of some of those facilitating aspects. But we're now moving into areas where people can actually get good results that they weren't necessarily getting before. It felt like all hype until a lot of recent models and recent techniques that people have made it possible to use your terminology in your QA process or in your generation process. And those kinds of things are key to moving beyond benchmarks that reflect general model capabilities to what actually matters for your organization. So I think that's where a lot of the gap is today, and what people need to bridge to be successful is to make sure that it's relevant for them. And that's more than just a generic translation capability. That's a lot of the other translation necessities that go around it. So people often have started at that outside edge of improving things that support the translation process, but they're getting into now more capabilities to actually do generation and quality checking and quality assurance processes, even with LLMs today.
All right, all right. Um, this is the harder question. What holds people back?
Oh, this is a tricky one.
Yeah.
So here's where I'll share one of the ways that I've been thinking about LLMs and NMT and the whole translation technology ecosystem. So I like to think of this as if we think of NMT as like a rail system where you can transport cargo and people and you use rails and you can change out the engine to achieve different performance or to go through different terrain. You can have different types of cars on it, but fundamentally the way that you control that is through rails. Versus LLMs are more like airplanes, where you can get to lots of different destinations, but the way that you control it is different than the way that you control a train. And I think that's where a lot of the gap has come in is that LLMs produce really fluent output that doesn't match your terminology, that doesn't fit your setting, that is harder sometimes to detect what the issues are. That often with NMT, it was easy for people to tell where there were issues because the issues were kind of obvious that you'd have sort of translationese or you'd have things that were more obviously broken. With LLM, some of that is a lot harder to tell because the errors are more subtle and the control that people need is different. That the way that people would need to ensure that their terminology is applied and their stylistic preferences are applied. They're not fine-tuning these models necessarily. It's a different control system.
Yeah, on personal experience, I will tell you that you can, and it's not a good idea, but you can literally point, let's say Code or Claude at a repository, no, I'm speaking about building software, not just
Yep.
general content, but literally at a software repository and just say, hey, give me a French version here.
Mhm.
Find all my files and give me a French version, and it will do it.
Mhm.
And we have somebody in our company that says, "Good luck."
Yeah.
You know,
Yep. Well,
so
yeah.
it looks to an untrained eye like it did it, right?
Yep.
It looks like it did it, but
Yep. But there are often so many subtle things that can go wrong,
right,
particularly that if you just say translate, that's what it's going to try to do. But
right,
sometimes you might have needed a cultural adaptation. Sometimes you
right.
needed specific things preserved or specific things mapped in a certain way that you might need dates to be preserved or changed in some way.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
it doesn't know any of those instructions. So if you just say translate, you'll get something that might look on the surface to be a translation, but it has a lot of flaws in it because of the things that it didn't guess or didn't wasn't able to know that were essential. And a lot of
Right,
those kinds
right,
of things are going to be important for people to fill in,
right,
like,
right.
that when they have complex data needs, that has to be part of the equation that translate isn't going to be enough.
Right. So you bring up date format. That is traditionally an internationalization issue. Like
Hmm.
the wrong method, function, class was used, a date format was hard coded, something like that. So that's where code actually needs to be corrected. Now, the other part of the experiments we do is just have Claude internationalize software, and it
Hmm.
looks really good. But even in a small application, what we've seen is you go to run the application, suddenly you've broken your code. So again, AI being very helpful, but dangerous in a way because it doesn't necessarily scale well without really proper controls on top of that. I think we're going to get into that a little bit. I wrote these questions like last week, so I haven't memorized them.
That'll
But
be
but but that issue of how do you scale this power? You have all this power. How do you put it under control and then scale it because it has to work not just for one small team but presumably across your company.
fun.
So, like I said, things can get out of control a little bit quickly. What are the warning signs that a use case that you're trying isn't really quite ready?
Yeah. Well, definitely inconsistent results If you're
Hmm.
running something and you're not getting consistent results, that's a problem.
Hmm.
Errors that, if you're noticing that your date
Hmm.
format's not correct or that you have terminology that's not being preserved,
Hmm.
there are many of those kinds of issues. But even just structurally or in terms of operations and maintenance, people need to have tried it end to end. And a lot of
Hmm.
times,
Hmm.
pilots sit in a space where there's a lot of human support that then
Hmm.
in production, that support isn't going to be there, the triage of
Right.
individual requests and
Right.
things. And so signs that it's not ready to go to production are when you try it at any scale where it doesn't have human remediation, things will break. And I see a lot of teams get stuck at that spot where they can
Hmm.
correct individual failures that they're seeing, but not get the patterns that would be necessary to actually
Hmm.
bridge from the demo or demo or
Hmm.
pilot to actual production. Because in production, there are lots of patterns, like you can't predict every single pattern, and you can't, there'll be
Hmm.
things that come about in that space. So there's more uh, uh, that's end-to-end testing and the ability to have a fallback or rollback and to even know
Hmm.
if you need to activate that. So there's
Hmm.
more than just like getting the model performance. It's also getting the system ready so that you could use it in production.
Got it. Got it. All right. So, I'm going to just kind of toot my own horn a little bit here with LingoPort. One of the ways we work to present an LLM engine with the information to run a consistent and good um, translation is with hierarchical prompting.
Mhm.
So, the challenge with software is like every string that needs to be translated or message that needs to be translated is pretty short. And so you take a word like load, and load in English can be used in many different ways that might have a different translation. There's, load the file. There's how much load can this bridge hold in a truck, before it collapses? What's the load of there's the load of a circuit. There's all kinds of uses of the word load. So what we do is, first of all, we have string level, like a visual representation of how the string is being used in the application that we capture all, there's many cases like from Figma where we capture that and associate it with the string automatically, right? We can capture it in a web app automatically. Manually, we can take a screenshot and associate it with a string, for instance. So you have this visual picture that goes on. And incidentally, whether you're using an LLM or NMT in a human, that this level of prompting actually is super useful, whether it's a human or for AI. The
Yeah.
second is we're adding a little bit more string prompting right now, but the second level is project prompting, like, that says something about like, this software is used to manage a hardware store's inventory or something like that and then you might point towards a terminology file as well as documentation. um, that's pretty important set of prompting because it actually trains the AI right away on how is this used. Third would be a system level prompt that would be something like, translate this into these languages. Don't be verbose. I don't need the reason for this translation. Just give me the data, right?
Mhm.
That's an example of a system level. And that's then passed. It can go through a TMS and go straight to an LLM. And then when it comes back, it's very important that you have, you can run another, LLM QA system on it as well. But it's very important that you have a way to like view this and edit this. So all of that is something that we facilitate together and bring together because mistakes happen. We also even have like an algorithm for like, don't make the translation longer than this. And if it's longer than that, we reject it, stuff like that. So,
Yeah, but that's all part of the control system that's
right.
needed, and you didn't need a lot of that for NMT because people were
No,
relying on the properties of the model itself. And these
right,
models are much
right,
more flexible, but they don't make the right guesses out of the box. So
right,
the information that you're supplying to it is the essential components. And some of those
right.
NMT couldn't have used anyway, where NMT wasn't aware of some of the connections that you're able to feed to LLMs. So you get even more capabilities to do more that's in context and actually it's really powerful, but it requires a different sort of system. So it's
Right, right,
definitely a transition. And
right.
I'm excited about what it can do when it has that extra information. But that's where like building that extra information is a step that I think many people didn't anticipate with LLMs because they're promoted to be so powerful and so good at this, but they don't get those things right without more context. So being able to reliably get them the context that they need is a big part
Yes,
of the problem.
yes. And this is me talking, not, I'm just a guy, right? But when I hear various CEOs with large layoffs announce that, well, they're going to run, half their company on AI. In my mind, I'm like, no, 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 no. This is not how it works.
Yeah.
This is a convenient excuse because your numbers aren't working right and you're cutting your staff.
Yeah.
I just don't get that. But anyway, all right. So how do people test and where do they fall short? What's worked? What's fallen down in production?
Yeah, this is a good one. One of the things that I think is so cool about how LLMs have come out has been the chat interface that it has allowed people to have access to models that previously would have required engineering and science to interact with. And so the new modality with chat has opened up that people can tinker and experiment and do lots of stuff. But that's not the same thing as doing something in production. And so one of the biggest things that I see as a problem where people have an issue is if they're doing their prototyping and they're debugging in a chat system that has different behavior and it has different memory baked into it and it has different contextual clues that don't come for free in production. And so that gap between like if people are prototyping things in chat, they're often very disappointed when they get that implemented in production because it seems to like know less. Because it does. Because if you did multiple things in a chat interface, it has all of that in memory. And the agents that you would be using in production or APIs that you'd be using in production don't. And so that's one of the big pieces of disappointment. So the recommendation would be to make sure to test early. Like it's okay to debug in chat, but be very aware that that's not the same
Mhm.
as the production environment. People actually need to test in the production environment and make sure that the way that it's implemented from a production side actually works. Because I think that's one of the big places that a lot of people have gotten tripped up.
Yep, yep, yep. And I will say, it's very powerful for programmers to set up a lot of basic work and the like. But like you say, you run into this wall where you really need to have people involved. And you can complain, well, it'll be different in 5 years. Yeah, maybe. But I think in a way in some ways we expect too much
Yeah.
because that first step was so easy, and
Yep.
powerful. All right, how do LLMs fit alongside existing workflows? Um,
This is a great question.
right.
LLMs, like we talked about, have a lot of language fluency that they can produce output that on the surface looks correct, but translation memory and glossaries and term bases and style guides contain information that the LLMs won't know. So LLMs have generic knowledge. They don't have these pieces of knowledge unless
Right.
you have a way of giving it to them. Um, Now there is some compatibility issue that if you can't just like take your entire translation memory and say LLM figure out what's relevant or what's not. You could. It would be very expensive and it wouldn't necessarily do the thing that you're trying to rely on translation memory for,
Mhm.
of
Mhm.
accessing a previously approved translation and reusing that for consistency and um, that sort of system, like a translations cache, I still see that as very necessary alongside LLMs. I think
Mhm.
that can evolve because LLMs don't necessarily have to operate and don't necessarily operate as well at the segment level. That they're much more contextual, and so some of these
Mhm.
workflows I think can and should evolve to be more compatible with LLMs because I think there's a really powerful synthesis of that. But LLMs definitely do not replace translation memory and glossaries,
Mhm.
and they don't
Mhm.
replace human review,
Mhm.
especially because human review is one of the important places where we can decide to intervene, to even notice that there's something wrong
Mhm.
with either the model's information, the translation memory, the glossaries. Like human review is one of those keys. We need to figure out how to make that, how to get the right things in front of people that it's not going to be every segment post editing everything. Like those kinds of
Mhm.
workflows are not necessarily the right way, or aren't necessarily going to be the optimal way to do it. But I think human review is going to continue to be essential in order to have the right combination of LLM capabilities and assets that are helping control how your output comes out.
All right. I will say that in my little world here, speaking with customers, that on the software side, and you have to understand that most LingoPort customers are really dealing with a lot of scale.
Mhm.
They're supporting anywhere from, several teams to several thousand developer teams, right? So, there is an aspect of, going into this fairly carefully, right? And so what I see mostly is the planning of using LLM more aggressively for the QA aspect so that
Mhm.
they direct the human and using a normal workflow of and let's not forget like technically using translation memory is AI. It's not LLM, but it's AI. You know.
Debatable.
Right, right, right.
But okay.
It's an earlier form of AI. I mean, if you go and
Yeah.
look on Wikipedia and other places, you'll see that yeah, it is included in the larger umbrella. But
Mhm.
at the same time, uh, the other challenge is that the fluency of various LLMs is going to be different depending upon the locale that's required. And I don't really
Mhm.
know this, but its fluency for target markets like Saudi Arabia might be very different than another country that is choosing similar languages, for instance. Depending upon just how much of that language the LLM has been trained on. And it's very hard to know that,
Yeah. Well,
actually.
but there actually are some very recent, like in the last couple of months
Mhm.
developments in that area where a
Mhm.
lot of the things that we've been talking about, when I say that LLMs have a lot of fluency, you're totally right. That is not universal. The performance is
Mhm.
very uneven. That's for
Mhm.
languages that have high representation. So the ones that are the most popular economic ones, those are the ones that have really strong
Mhm.
performance. But
Mhm.
lower resourced languages don't necessarily. There are concerted efforts right now from companies like Cohere that have built a suite of models called Tiny Aya that are intentionally balanced with different language mixes. So they have like a model that's specifically trained on African and West African languages. They have one that's Southeast Asian. They've done this deliberately to try to reduce the English dominance and to make it
Mhm.
easier to have smaller models that are feasible to fine tune or to deploy without being super resource intensive. And I think that's a really exciting move to try to expand the amount of languages that are covered well. And so
Hmm.
LLMs can produce a lot of things for a lot of languages, but they weren't targeted towards that. Like those aren't their main use case. Like they have, a lot of the frontier models have capabilities, but they're uneven and they're not the intentional focus of those. Whereas there are other intentional models that are coming out that are specifically trying to provide better multilingual support. So Cohere, Meta, several companies have been working on offerings in those areas.
Okay, very good. That's good information. It brings up, hopefully I'm not stealing this question from somebody in the audience, but it's it I would imagine for a lot of people that it's somewhat paralyzing that there's so much change happening.
Hmm.
You know what I mean? So how do you keep up?
Hmm. I mean, I think part of the answer is that you have to be selective about what you want to keep up with, and that
Uh-huh.
that should match some needs that you have. And for some people, they actually have an NMT system and style assets and terminologies that work really well for them. For those people, I wouldn't say that they should need to change. I think
Uh-huh.
that there are people who are really well served by the setups that they have, particularly if they have a lot of consistency needs and they've been able to resolve those with NMT. There's not necessarily a reason to switch. So I would drive the roadmap for what you want to switch to based on needs that you have. Many teams haven't had all of their needs met or have a hard time testing or trying things and have a difficult time getting the terminology being precise and some of those kinds of things with NMT. They'll also have some of those challenges with LLMs, but there are different levers that you can pull and different ways that you can combine that. So I think it's really not about trying to always stay at the forefront or always adopting the next thing, rather about picking the things that are strategically aligned for you. And so that's my first piece of advice is, like give yourself permission to not try every single thing because you will
Mhm.
burn out trying to do that.
Mhm.
But the second is that the instructions and the assets and those pieces of information, that's really important because those are some of the pieces that help you stabilize when you move from one model to another. That if you're just counting on prompts, the prompts can be really brittle with how that they're paired with a specific model. That if you try something in ChatGPT and then you try it in Claude, you get a bit different results. Same sort of thing will happen if you use one GPT model versus another. And those kinds of inconsistencies can be unacceptable for some production cases. Some companies can tolerate it, some can't. A lot can't, but those kinds of things get a lot smoother if you have good style and if you have good assets, like the data assets that you have, if those are fed into instructions, that helps you stabilize more
Mhm.
than just prompting alone.
Got it. All right, good, good. And I just want to say we've got a couple of questions in the Q&A. Keep those questions coming. That's awesome. All right, great. Um, I want to talk about risk a little bit here. That comes up a lot. There's privacy, definitely concern, although, I think I'll just, sort of cut that in that so many companies have approved versions of AI that they can work with that are within their network. But let's say you're having an LSP run the AI for you. You may not, privacy becomes an issue.
Mhm.
There's hallucinations, problems, terminology. What aspects really matter? You
Yeah.
know.
Well, I think privacy is one of those prerequisites that
Mhm.
you have to make sure that privacy is honored throughout every touch point. That if you're working
Mhm.
with LSPs and freelancers or whoever is involved in your translations processes, you need to make sure
Mhm.
that your privacy concerns are handled. And um, that means using approved tools. That means using the correct setups. That means not, that sensitive information needs to be masked. It means there are different complexities depending on your privacy needs. But I think that's one of the initial things that needs to be in place just as a foundation. Um, Hallucinations. This is an interesting one because hallucinations do happen. They're getting less and less. That the more recent models
Mhm.
have been intentionally trained to have this behavior less. But one of the things that happens in translation, because translation has a source, is that it's kind of just filling in information that it had to. It's not quite the same thing as like making something up. Like models will hallucinate when they're like making something up. But here, often it's more kind of innocent, where like in a sense, that doesn't mean it's not damaging, but it means like a lot of the fix for that is better specification. In many cases, I'm not saying that
Mhm.
universally, but in many cases, it's that it's plausibly filling in a gap and
Mhm.
didn't fill that in the way you want it. And that's not quite the same thing as like making things up like crazy hallucination. That does happen, but most of the time it's this more innocent, like it's filling in plausible information that just didn't match. And so
Mhm.
that's a different kind of problem. And prompts and terminology, we talked a little bit about prompts can be very tied to models, and with those being, people need to think about ways to move to have prompt and terminology information that they can make portable, so don't have to start from scratch with every additional model move, because those things remain important for whichever models you're using.
Okay. Here we go. We've kind of touched on this in a lot of answers, um, but let's go over it again in specific detail. How do we scale to the enterprise level, and is prompting enough?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the
Mhm.
interesting questions is that what the enterprise level even means to people today is somewhat changing. That a lot of
Mhm.
tools are in the hands of people who previously couldn't have gotten high quality translations, and now they can get translations. The question of whether those are high quality or not remains, and whether they're aligned with what you would want to produce. So I think that in many ways, translations workflows, and this definitely depends on what you're talking about. Whether it's software or documents,
Mhm.
or it depends on the specific modality. But a lot of enterprises are having some decentralization of content processes. And in that case, I think one of the critical factors that people will have to think about is not necessarily everything is going to run through TMSs. Not necessarily everything is going to run through the same QA processes. And so some of those processes need to be rethought to make sure that linguistic intelligence can hook up to the tools that people are using, and that you can then govern and monitor that in a different way, because I think it's unrealistic to expect everything to continue to flow through a secondary process, because there will be companies that make the decision for the sake of speed and efficiency, that they're willing to take a risk. But I think putting
Mhm.
linguistic intelligence in a place where those tools can access it is one of the keys to being able to scale to enterprise support of the future.
Right. Now, I'm going to answer my own question from the perspective of software.
Hmm.
Because software is development is it's a much sort of it's a very controlled process, when you compare it to many, like having different marketing teams or something like that, right stuff. You have central you have central continuous engineering. You have, like processes like pull requests and approval, review of that code and the like, and then merging it into master. You have all these things that happen. And first, when it comes to internationalization, you can get a lot of results that are very inconsistent out of simply letting everybody apply, AI to have a review of the code that they have with an internationalization requirement. So what you really do need is some kind of centralized control on that that has some built-in I18N intelligence so that you get a
Oh,
consistent result. Like I was talking about really early, I think even before we were staging, like if you point let's say Claude at a repository, you can get an internationalized result and then have the application look good but not run. Even on
oh,
simple batches of code, that's what we've seen. So it's very useful, but you need to have proper sort of instructions and control, and then a management view of where are you at. So those are they're literally the same factors that you consider when you have humans working on code, but it's sort of another level of control of what you're applying to that work.
yeah.
So it's really not any different than that, but you get different results based on what you feed, and there's a lot of different understanding of what I18N is amongst developers, which is pretty natural. So you really have to have something centralized that has those instructions baked in. The second is the same thing for localization. You can get a lot of really powerful results quickly that are wrong. So you have to have a baked in process and review mechanism and the like in there for software specifically. And what I like to see, and the amount of people actually doing this is small that I see in the world, but it's very capable with what we have now with Localizer that a designer can, create something in Figma or a developer can create something. It can be grabbed right away, translated right away via the prompting engines that I talked about, fed back to the developer so the developer actually either has it, so they just point to a string ID as they're developing. In the case when it was written by let's say from Figma from the design stage, or as the developer is going, they constantly have visual feedback to what does this look like in Chinese? What does this look like in Farsi? Whatever it may be, they have that. And then you have a webhook that basically says, well, this was the LLM translation. Now we want to have review and
Yeah.
pull that translation back so that you always have visibility. And to a developer, the fact that they could always have visibility to what they do is kind of powerful. Now, I know most organizations aren't ready for that state, but I really think that's where we're going to a point where localization in software is always on. It's
Mhm.
like it's always delivered, and it's delivered within the next cycle of your continuous integration. I mean, it's just like boom, boom, boom. You know, that is available so that visually we're always seeing that. But then we have this sort of grabbing it a second time and running our QA analysis and running the humans where we need. So that's my vision and it's funny because it's been a vision for years and years for us, and it's just now coming true, which is
When
super cool.
it exactly like
Yeah,
this is an amazing version where people
yeah,
wouldn't have been able to do that, that a developer
right,
wouldn't have been able to interact with pretty good translations. So they would wait until there were translations that went
right,
through the regular process.
or
And now you can get translations in different places. And so having the tools hooked up in ways
right,
that the people who need them can use them. And then you can invest your quality improvements around where you might have gaps or
right,
where
right,
around you can do it in a more targeted fashion instead of the secondary localization processes being a gatekeeper. You can have a lot more that's out that's accessible to the people who are doing it. But for it to be good, it has to have some of the controls that you're talking about. So
right,
that,
right,
so
right,
that's essential.
right.
Yeah.
And I just kind of surprised myself. I thought this was going to have a number on it, but That was it for the questions that I
Okay.
had. So,
Well, they were great
so
questions.
um, we have questions already in the Q&A interface. I'm going to start going to them. We have four of them, so that's rocking. That's great. Please add more questions. We'll stay here a bit and we will take them all. I there's one thing I just want to mention that especially right now, there there are a lot of cuts going on in the software industry. So we're seeing localization departments that were understaffed to begin with, now even more critically understaffed. So it's a very difficult time to experiment. But I do think as a matter of survival for those localization professionals, you've got to find some budget to experiment because the pressure is on to take advantage of these new systems. So attending webinars like this, learning about them, scoping out ideas, and working with some experts like Elizabeth, that it's really important that we all find time to have these conversations and to prototype and to give things a try. So with that positive note, I think I'm going to start reading off the questions. All right. So, the first one, is it true that because the translations from LLMs seem so fluent that even trained post editors can miss inaccuracies in the translations?
Mhm.
I'm going to leave that for you, Elizabeth.
Yeah, well, definitely. And it's an interesting thing because even though LLMs often produce translations that are more fluent, it can take more time to find and correct the errors in them because they're more subtle than it takes to correct something that's obviously wrong. Because often when something's obviously wrong, people have more, ability
Mhm.
to easily see what it needs to be. When people are having to do a serious debate about, is this right or is this wrong? I'm not sure, it can be much trickier. And so it's
Mhm.
not necessarily more efficient if the LLMs are not right. So it is
Mhm.
it is a really tricky thing, and many people have found it difficult to adjust to LLM post editing.
I'll also just mention that some of the QA verification tools I've seen really sort of put a number of risk, like a risk threshold for certain words. And that can
Mhm.
probably be helpful for the human translator. Again,
Yeah,
LingoPort's not an LSP, so we
yeah,
don't deal with that problem every day. So I don't really
yeah.
necessarily always feel the
Yeah, it's not the problem that you're working in
right,
all the
right,
time.
right,
Anything to do with software and scale, you're great.
right,
But
right.
I think that just from my perspective on this, I think that post editing itself is kind of going to change, or I hope to see it change as we have different tools that can help people navigate the language differently and
Mhm.
so. Yes, the answer is tr it's true that post editing can be difficult and fluent, and the LLM fluency can be a tricky part of that. But I do
Mhm.
hope that we move past post editing for at least some linguistic intelligence.
Very good. Okay. Next one. I heard recently that NMT is being phased out by many tech tools and service providers, or at least is getting significantly less investment. Is that the case?
Uh, y- yes, and well, it's complicated, I'll say. It's
Mhm.
definitely true that most people that I'm talking to, at least, are investing the bulk of their budget in improving LLM capabilities. And that makes
Mhm.
sense that a lot of the things that you would do to improve NMT don't also improve LLM. That
Mhm.
like constraint decoding in an NMT doesn't get you anything in your
Mhm.
LLM. You need a different way. So it does
Mhm.
make sense that budgets are shifting towards LLM. But in terms of being able to actually move past NMT, a lot of people are using hybrids and they might do like an NMT MT and then an LLM QA step. So they're being composed in different ways. So I think a lot of providers are still using NMT a lot, but the shift is happening to LLM. So I would say NMT, I don't think it's dead, but I think
Hmm.
most people are rightly investing more in LLMs because it does offer more control and flexibility and things once the controls are in place.
Yeah, along those lines, as an outside observer, I always think of something like uh, Google Translate being an advantage as an asset for Gemini. I don't know if that's truly the case, but Google Translate covers just so many languages at this point.
Well, now they're experimenting with having Gemini support Google Translate,
Hmm.
particularly
Hmm.
around translations where there's some ambiguity, allowing people to
Hmm.
like drill in and provide more specific, like what they meant, or to see that
Hmm.
when there are multiple choices. And they're
Hmm.
using Gemini to power that. So in that setting, they still have NMT, but they're also using LLM.
Hmm. Hmm.
So those kind of hybrid solutions are arising, at least in the short term. I don't know if it will fully replace
Hmm.
NMT.
Hmm. Hmm.
LLMs are more expensive than NMT, so it's not a neutral move. So I think
Right.
people are still trying to figure out what the right future ecosystem is, and we're very
Hmm.
much in a transitional phase right now.
Right. Good. Okay. Is language service LangOps maturity? LangOps is not necessarily, it means a lot to a lot of different people, I will say. But is language service LangOps maturity the short-term goal for organizations? How are knowledge graphs going to be integrated cost effectively in companies in the next few years? That's a two-part question. Maybe you can read it also.
Yeah.
Um, Honestly, I don't feel like I'm qualified to answer that question, but
That's
um,
okay. I can answer
yeah.
from my from what I'm seeing. So
Uh-huh.
I definitely find that a lot of conversations are shifting naturally towards LangOps, which I think is so great because
Mhm.
organizations thinking about how can they actually use linguistic knowledge to support their business goals and support their customers. Like a lot of things in localization have focused on metrics like Blue and Comet and various things that
Mhm.
are good for us to understand the like linguistic progress, but that's not the same as business value. And so a lot of the shifts that are happening right now are much more along the LangOps lines where people are really thinking, how do I use these tools and have the right
Mhm.
information to power business and customer communications?
Mhm.
And I think that shift is naturally the thing that a lot of organizations are kind of going through.
Mhm.
They might not be calling it LangOps, but a lot of these moves really are LangOps maturity gaining things.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, so that's kind of part one. And then part two, knowledge graphs. I alluded to this earlier that I think that some of the assets that we have, around translation memory and term bases and things that those will likely need to evolve to be more compatible with LLMs. And knowledge graphs are a very powerful way to do this. That's the combination of knowledge graphs and LLMs can encode a lot more information and relationships that are essential for getting translations right. So I think that as knowledge graphs get more integrated with LLMs, and that people will find that is a powerful way to control the output and to make the generation actually match their needs. So I think that knowledge graphs are going to see a boost in the localization space because of how well they fit with LLMs.
Mhm. Okay. I will just add this, as it relates to software, I'm still kind of amazed how many software teams are moving files around manually.
Mhm.
They're grabbing file like the automation that Localizer provides is what I call like foundational technology that's in it. But the fact that people are still going, oh, here's the file, I got it from the developer. I'm going to take this file, I'm going to shove it here, right? That
Mhm.
people are still doing that manually. Um, the problem with that is it takes time. It essentially waits for this manual gate, which always causes further delay. And it also makes a likelihood that something is missed or that an error in that file gets um, sort of like we do all these file checks, like coming and going from to the
Mhm.
translation, and we find stuff broken all the time. Like I see it because it's in our software, and um, so that manual activity still goes on. So a lot of us who are attending these webinars and we're plugged in, it's very easy to get, sort of thinking like, oh, the whole world is so advanced, and it's really not.
It is, this is a good reminder. And I've
Right,
even talked to some people recently who said, well, aren't agents going to solve that? It's like, well, no, like they will scale chaos even faster. So
right, right,
having
right,
good processes and structure, those foundations are essential for being
right,
able,
right, right.
to, they'll, yeah.
Okay, good, good. All right. So I think this is our last question. If somebody wants to throw one more in, we do have time. But this is what I have here. Are there specific formats for this is a great question. Are there specific formats for terminology databases and style guides that should be used for LLMs? And if yes, how would those look like? Or is it sufficient to simply make existing assets which were created for human use available to the LLM?
Yeah, this is a great question. So I'll try to answer this step by step. So the existing style and terminology assets were largely made for humans, not for LLMs. You can make them available to LLMs, but they don't necessarily know which things apply and where, and they don't necessarily they're not able to bridge the gap perfectly. They can make a lot of guesses, but there is a bit of an incompatibility issue where what was made to support human translators isn't necessarily the right structure for LLMs. And as for what has, whether there is a new style, this is one of the things that people are experimenting with. That people found that if they just took the whole style guide and stuffed it in the prompt, that actually hurt performance because then it's
Mm,
confused that it has all of this extra stuff that it doesn't know what to do with and it starts adding unnecessary things. Like, so that's definitely not the way. So people have
mm,
to have more targeted ways of understanding what's even relevant from this. And so that's the move from the current sort of assets to what LLMs could use also involves not just the storage, but the retrieval of how do you know what's relevant and how do you get that to the LLM so that you can actually have it applied correctly. And that's the puzzle that a lot of people are trying to solve right now. So there's a lot of work in progress, but there hasn't emerged like a new design standard for style guides or for, most people are still using TMX for term bases. Like there has not yet emerged that I've seen a new standard for that, but I think that people are working on it. I think that's one of the areas that people are finding that really still needs a lot of uh, con continued advancement of the
mhm,
tool. So
mhm.
this is one of the areas that I'm most interested in, and that I think is going to be essential for being able to get that control structure in place.
Wow, that's pretty fascinating to me. All right. Well, I think that ends the questions. We're finishing up 5 minutes early. That's always good. People can be on time for their next meeting. Elizabeth, thanks for your great input. You've been a wonderful guest. It's really been fun to get to know you in preparation here. That's been dynamite. Thanks, everybody. Most of you stayed on. I really appreciate that. And we're working on the next webinar for April. If you've signed up, you'll get what that's going to be. And thank you. Have a great Wednesday or whatever day it is, whatever day time it is where
It
you
is
are.
Wednesday. Yep,
Yeah.
yep.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks, Adam. Thanks,
Thanks,
everyone.
Elizabeth. All right. Bye-bye, everyone.